happening. Okay. I'm going to start. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, good morning, and dear viewers and audience of the World Muslim Communities Council. Welcome to our online lecture series again. Today, it is our great honor to welcome Dr. Kadara Swaleh from Germany to give us a talk. Dr. Kadara is a research fellow in Leibniz-Zentrum Modern Orient Institute. Is very, as from the name you can tell, it's a very well-known established institute. Today he is going to talk about the cultural heritage and social development of Muslim communities in East Africa. So we would like to hear from him that how global Muslims can learn and should learn about Muslims communities and their culture, their intellectual and social development there. So without further ado, let's have Dr. Kadara to give us a lecture.
Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. I'm very much honored to be invited by the World Muslim Forum to discuss briefly about Muslim communities and social development in East Africa. I am going to focus on two countries. Original East Africa consisted of three countries, that is Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But now East Africa has expanded and taken up more members. It has reached up to 7 to 8 member countries. But for this particular presentation, I am going to focus on these two countries, Kenya and Tanzania. The spread of Islam in East Africa took different paths, different trajectories from one country to the other. But if we look between Kenya and Tanzania, for example, we find that there is a kind of similarity. You'll find here that Islam was brought along the East African coast through trade from Arabia, particularly southern Yemen. And you'll find that the Indian Ocean trade played a very significant role that saw different people, not only from Yemen, even Persians, making their imprint as far back as 11th century and 12th century, according to different town chronicles and according to archaeological evidence that has been done very extensively. There are also narratives that in Yemen and other places, there was some intersect religious conflict between the Shia and the Sunnis, and they found it impressive and very welcoming to come to East African coast. And therefore, a lot of literature indicate that those who came either for refuge or for livelihood and for trade, their priority was not to spread Islam per se, but Islam was spread in this region, and it is regarded as historical accident. And therefore, when we look at the overview of Muslim communities in East Africa, for example, Kenya and Tanzania, we find very important features that tells us what is the condition of Muslims in this country. How is their situation? Under which circumstances are they conducting their business? How are they practicing their faith over the centuries, and so on and so forth. So if we look at this overview, we find that, first of all, Muslims are a minority in these countries, and they constitute at least 10% of the population of these countries. And again, we find that since post-colonial period, when these countries gained independence in the early 60s, Kenya got its independence in 1963, Tanzania got its political independence in 1962, we find that the Muslim community, as a minority community, they have been marginalized in different ways, in education, in employment, in political participation. And this is a sentiment that is still felt in this region up to the present period. Another feature that is very common in both countries of East Africa is Islamophobia. We find that the Muslim community find themselves targeted, including their history. For example, the role of Muslims in historical times is not represented properly in school books and in other literatures. We don't find Muslim contribution as positive, if at all they appear in textbook and in other public domain. In most cases, you find that Muslims are accused of being slave traders. They are being accused of many other ills, which is a generalization of Muslims in the global arena. What happens to Muslims in other countries is put together and generalized as Muslim all over. So Islamophobia on historical context, collective punishment, for example, when it comes to the question of terrorism in this region and other places. In brief, Muslims in Kenya and in East Africa, they feel that they are second-class citizens. They are subjected to a lot of discrimination. And for example, when Muslims are applying for important government documents like passports, ID card, and other important documents, the process of acquiring this document is tough, and it is double when, for example, a Christian is applying for a similar document. And again, we find that when the political space was liberalized in 1990s, there had been a lot of interest from majority Muslim communities like Mombasa, in the coastal Kenya, trying to have their own political party. And again, in Zanzibar, we have seen as far back as 2014 and 15, we find that the government in power, they do their best to make sure that these Muslim organizations or political parties do not succeed. And if they win election, they make sure that that election is stolen. And in the end, it causes a lot of violence and bloodshed, disadvantaging Muslims in these communities. When we look at the impact of Islam in East Africa, particularly on the coastal regions along the Indian Ocean, you find an open manifestation of Islam in terms of dress code. You find Muslim men and women are dressing in a manner that you can find openly. This is Islamic way of dressing. At the same time, we find that there has been a lot of language influence in East Africa. I cannot say that Arabic is an official language or it's a national language in East Africa, but there are so many people who speak Arabic language. There are those whose ancestry is directly from Arabia, like Oman, Yemen, and other countries. You find that in their businesses and in their homes, they speak pure colloquial dialect that is spoken in their ancestral countries. But the majority of Muslims, whether they are of Indian, African, or Swahili origin, most of them speak Arabic, which we can call it the standard Arabic or Fusha. And this is because of the Islamic influence whereby young children start to learn Quran in the Duksi or in the madrasa from the time they are very, very, very young. Another impact is cuisine. You find in East Africa, there is a lot of collection of cuisine, which you can say some of it is Arabian, some of it is Asian or Indian because of the influx of the Indian communities that came to East Africa to construct the colonial railway in the beginning of the 20th century. So you find that the cuisine among the people of East Africa, particularly Muslim, whether it is chapati, whether it is rice and bread, and all kind of food that you find in the Arabian Peninsula or Indian Peninsula, you also find it in East African coast or in other parts of the country. Again, there's something which I call the code of conduct because of the socialization which was embedded in Islam. You find that with time, even to the present period, an acceptable code of conduct, the normative behavior is described as usta Arabo, to be like an Arab, or in other words, to be like a Muslim. So that conduct of being a Muslim or being an Arab, which is used loosely between Muslim and Arab, is a standard, acceptable way of behavior, way of interacting with other people. And that's why we have a term that is still used today called Usta Arabu, Asta Araba. A person who is behaving well is called Mr. Arabu, well-mannered, well-civilized. The one who is behaving contrary to what is expression is said that he lacks Usta Arabu, and so on and so forth. And finally, I would like to look at the contribution of Islam towards the creation and development of the Swahili language. And one of the evidence is that you find that in the Swahili language, there is a huge percentage of Arabic loanwords, which some experts have put between 30 and 40%. Quickly, if we look at a few examples of Arabic loanwords that are in Swahili language, Kitabu means book, Raisi president, Mahakama law code, Alfu means 1,000, Mia 100, Marehemu deceased, Mahaba love, Ishirini, Thalathini, Arbaini, Hamsini, Sitini, Sabini, and so on and so forth. Today, with the modern technology and network, you can find all this information readily. Another issue I would like to highlight is the coexistence between Muslims and other faiths. if we look at East African societies and communities, even before Islam, when, for example, the Portuguese came to East Africa, although they were very violent and inhuman, and their rule was very destructive. But aside from the Portuguese, we had, for example, the great Chinese navigator and explorer Chen He, who came to East African coast, especially in places like Mombasa, Lamu, and Pate, and they left a very strong heritage and memory, which is still retold and discussed as one of the great times. Again, if we look at the treaties of Ibn Sa'id, or for example, Ibn Battuta, who traveled along the East African coast of Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, up to Sofala, for example, in Mozambique, you will find that the description is that the people of the coastal area, Indian coastal, were very friendly and they coexisted with people of other faith. Up to now, this is very, very true. We, for example, in these communities of Mombasa, for example, Lamu, Dar es Salaam, Tanga, and many other places, you find Hindus, Muslims, Zoroastrians, and Christians, who are the majority, in fact. People have been living together peacefully. For example, one of the nicknames of Mombasa, which has played a very big role in integration and cosmopolitanism in East African, it has been described for a very long period as Raha, Mombasa Raha. By Raha, it means it's a place of conviviality, the livelihood, the relation, the friendship between the local people, the migrants, and those who are passing by has been very, very convivial. So the relationship has long been excellent. But we have had several occasions, for example, tensions are brewing up over scarce resources, water, grazing land between Muslim and other communities. We have in Kenya these days a huge proliferation of evangelical Christianity, whereby, on the other hand, we find the Tabligh group or Muslim groups who are familiar with basic Bible studies, or they were Christian and later on converted to Islam. They have mastery of Bible, so they conduct in open places, for example, or in areas where Muslim Christian are majority, challenging the Christian around about whether the Bible is the word of God or not, whether Jesus was this or that. So this in Kiswahili is called mihadhara, singular is muhadhara, and they have borrowed heavily from the style and the work which was done by a great scholar like Sheikh Ahmed Didat of South Africa, and other groups from Tanzania like Sheikh Mazinge and others. So this is still ongoing in Kenya, and it is a potential source of conflict between Muslim and Christian. And finally, you find that during political election, politicians sponsor violence in order to chase away a particular electoral vote or voting community so that they run away and they have advantage during the election results and so on and so forth. And therefore, we have also had some cases in the past, in the 90s, where Christians, they banned a mosque, and Muslims in retaliation, they banned a church, but the government was quick and neutral in trying to cool down the tension and restore some peace in the community. What I can say about Muslims in East Africa is that it's a minority, but it's a very strong minority. They have strong resources, by being located in the coastal region, where these harbors and ports are playing a very important role. So the government tries to divide and rule. They try to empower some elites in the Muslim community by giving them tenders or monopoly of this particular trade or the other in order to use them. But generally speaking, you will find that there are a lot of challenges that face Muslims in East Africa. Discrimination. You'll find that during post-colonial period, from independence until maybe in the 90s, when the political space and multi-party politics became the norm of the day, there were no Muslim in bigger political position like ministers or big other position like permanent secretaries. Up to now, you find that, for example, in the last 10 years, the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, in his cabinet of 40 ministers, maybe there were 2 Muslim ministers who happened to be the friend of the president, and they were like a gateway for the government to have influence over the Muslim community and so on and so forth. So discrimination is there. When it comes to employment, you will find that a lot of Muslims in Kenya and Tanzania, they prefer to look for jobs in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries, because it is easy to get jobs in the Gulf countries than to get similar jobs in their own country because of nepotism, because of discrimination, and so on and so forth. There's also these questions of labeling. All Muslims are regarded as suspect, especially when it came to matters of fight against terrorism. But again, also on the part of Muslims themselves, we see there's lack of unity. Muslims, they are divided into different segments: Sunni, Shia, Salafi, Sufi, and so on and so forth. And the government sometimes, when they try to cause more disunity among Muslims, they try to put another wedge between Muslims, African Muslims and Arab Muslims. So these are some of the problems Muslim community have. It's a 10% is not a small number. For example, the population of Kenya today is around 50 to 55 million. If we have 10 to 15% Muslim, that's a good number. But the problem is that there is lack of unity due to different factors. Again, I feel that Muslims have misplaced priorities. Up to today, you find the biggest social development Muslims want to do is building more mosques, building this and that and that. And the community is in dire poverty, is illiterate, there is no employment, and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of priorities of Muslims and Muslim leadership is misplaced, and poverty is rampant. If you look at most of these slums, Majengo and Kibra and other places, majority of them are Muslim people. And again, Muslims are less educated, and this has a historical background. During colonial times, modern education or Western education was provided by missionary groups. The colonial government outsourced education to missionary groups, and Muslims were reluctant to send their children to missionary schools for fear of being converted to Christianity, and so on. So these are some of the challenges Muslims are facing both in Kenya and in Tanzania. When we talk about the solution, you find that up to today, Muslims in East Africa, internally, they feel that they are less Kenyan and less Tanzanians because of this label of being a Muslim. And at least in Tanzania, they have for the first time a president who is a Muslim, Samia, but still it's not enough. The president is an individual. The government is controlled by a whole structure. It's an institution. It's just like saying that when President Barack Obama was the president of the United States, did he change the situation of the Black community or African community in the US? He did, if he did anything, it's very little, because it's a system, it's an institution. So I feel the same with President Samia of Tanzania. Her hands are tied. Actually, she has been facing a lot of rebellion, even from her own political party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, labeling her, calling her an Arab. And because Tanzania is consisting of a unity government between Zanzibar and Tanganyika, you will find that as President Samia has a lot of baggage. As recently as the other day, there has been a lot of blame and a lot of sabotage on the president because of privatizing the port of Dar es Salaam. And it's like, why is it the problem was no longer privatization of the port? Why has it been privatized to DP World of United Arab Emirates? If it was privatized to the Americans or Germans or French, I think it could not have been an issue. So these are some of the challenges. As for Kenya, it is still a far and distant dream for any Muslim becoming a president. So this is the situation. So therefore, you will find that, for example, Muslims, I feel that for Muslims, at least to survive and make their life bearable, they must be united, first of all. Muslims must develop clear priorities. They should build more schools than mosques. There are hundreds of mosques in Dar es Salaam, in Mombasa, in Lamu, in Tanga. I think Muslims do not need more mosques. They need hospitals, they need libraries, they need schools, they need job centers, they need businesses. I think this is a problem. Muslims must shed the skin of naivety and adapt a posture of aggressiveness. An eye for an eye, al-ayn bin ayn, a sin be sin. This should be the posture of Muslim, because this naivety is, especially in Kenya, Muslims in Kenya, they were so loyal to the British. They felt they are part of the British. Up to today, there are several people in Kenya, especially the past generation, who feel that life under the British rule was much better, which was true. It was much better because they were respected, their religion was respected, and they got their share of employment and resources and so forth. But if Muslims are just saying, inshallah, hewallah, qudra, inna Allah ma sabirin, this is not enough. The Muslim must stand up for their right, because we find in Kenya, for example, each province has a share of the resources that are available there, has a share for the jobs to their own people, to their own youth, except in the province, Coast Province, where Muslims are the majority. The big share of those jobs and resources are given to people who are not Muslims and who are not from that region. This naivety, this cowardice is responsible for a raw deal that Muslims are getting both in Kenya and Tanzania. I also feel that there is a need for Baitul Mal, Muslim treasury. We have Sadaqah, we have Zakah. I think there should be a concerted effort to collect Zakah and other endowment like Waqf to improve the life and the livelihood of Muslim communities both in Kenya and Tanzania. The Muslim must stop petty and perennial squabbles of Shia Sunni, moon sighting, when is Ramadan beginning, when it is ending, Bid'ah and Sunnah. These are not doing any good to the Muslim community. Muslims should now start focusing on fundamental issues of development, of emancipation, of education, and the future of the Muslim Ummah in these communities. And again, Muslim leaders must be re-socialized and re-educated on community development. Community development is something very, very important. Muslims are rich, and the Quran and Islam have shown them the way of collecting these resources for the public good. But the Muslim ulama, they should know about the new requirement for the society, apart from just sitting in the mosque, praying and directing all problems to God. I'm not saying dua is something wrong. I believe as a Muslim that dua hiya mukhul ibadah, is the bone marrow of belief and faith. But we cannot fight poverty. Muslims cannot fight poverty through dua. Muslims cannot fight for their land, for their rightful share, for their resources through dua. This is not enough. This has to change if the Muslims want to prosper and to bequeath a better future for their children. And finally, because of poor leadership of Muslims in East Africa, we find that because of this education duality, a lot of Muslim clergy, Muslim ulama, Muslim elites, they never went to the Western schools. In Kenya, they don't speak English. And if you don't speak English in Kenya, you are disadvantaged. You cannot participate in this, participate in that. At least in Tanzania, Swahili is the official and national language. Muslims can articulate their issues just like any other educated people. But in Kenya, this is a big problem. And because of this duality of education, thousands of Muslims and younger Muslims who decide to pursue religious knowledge, they cannot be employed in Kenya because they cannot speak English, because they did not receive basic Western education. And what is the result? We find that when it comes to negotiation between the Muslim Ummah and the state, donor community, and the Muslim community, the Muslim ulama who have control over the Muslim masses are kept on the periphery. Instead, Muslim brokers, Muslim agents in the form of Muslim lawyers, Muslim architects, Muslim teachers, Muslim civil society groups, because they speak English, all what they need to do to represent Muslim, they put on a Muslim dress, a kofia, a long robe, and say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, they have become Muslim leaders. So Islam and Islamic cause and Islamic rights has been hijacked by Muslim brokers, and this must be stopped if we want to see real changes among the Muslim community in Kenya and Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Excellent presentation. And we learned a lot about Muslim communities in East Africa, especially in Kenya and Tanzania. We appreciate your sharing of knowledge about the development and the challenges, and in particular, the recommendation you have proposed to help the Muslim communities to grow and to develop in those countries. I think basically your lecture pretty much addressed most of the things, you know. Yeah, it's very comprehensive and very insightful. Again, thank you very much. And do you want to say something to our audience, and then we can conclude?
Maybe I would like to add something small. Thank you for introducing me as a researcher at the Leibniz-Zentrum Modern Oriental Center here in Berlin. In my background, my first degree was on sociology, my second degree was on Islamic studies, and my PhD was on anthropology. And it's anthropology of infrastructure. I'm looking at the impact of the new Silk Road, what is today called the Belt and Road Initiative, that was started by the People's Republic of China, by particularly President Xi Jinping in 2014, 2015, somewhere there. So Kenya is part of the new Silk Road, and there's a huge development of infrastructure, ports in Muslim area, which is called Lamu. The speed railway called SGR in Mombasa. In other words, I'm looking at the impact of these Chinese infrastructure projects among the Muslim community in Mombasa. And this is quite interesting. And I'm trying to see how is it benefiting the Muslim, or is it because of that post-colonial experience of the Muslim, the discrimination I'm talking about? Is this infrastructure having negative impact on the Muslim towns in Mombasa and in Dar es Salaam, for example? I'm looking both Dar es Salaam and Mombasa. Therefore,
great.
This is about me. But again, for 10 years, I went out of academia and I joined the politics of Kenya, and I became, for 10 years until 2021, I became a director of political affairs in the ruling party of Kenya. And while I was in that position, I became in charge of China-Kenya relations, especially party to party. And I visited China, particularly Chinese universities, to learn more about community development and so forth. And to the audience, particularly the Muslim brothers in Abu Dhabi and other places, for more than 5 decades, the Muslim world, the Gulf and other places, including Saudi Arabia, has been giving scholarship for Muslims in East Africa to advance their education. But most of this scholarship had been on Islam, theology, Sharia, and so on and so forth. We need what we call a paradigm shift. We need young people to get scholarship on economics, on development, and on IT, and on all other matters that is going to improve the livelihood of the communities back in East Africa. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we look forward to for your research about infrastructure development in Kenya, especially the infrastructure product by Chinese on Muslim communities. I hope it's a positive impact, and which can help Muslim communities to grow. And also, we highly appreciate your proposed advice that, yeah, the more scholarships and support should be given to support Muslim students in science and technology, economic, and beyond the Islamic studies. Yeah, this is a very candid advice. So with that, we thank you very much, Dr. Kadara, for this wonderful session. And we look forward to have you for next time. And thank you very much for watching. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you again for the opportunity.